Breaking the chain, my escape. My name is Karina, and my story is the backbone of my family's journey. I grew up in Aguascalientes, raised primarily by my grandparents. They gave me a childhood filled with love and stability. I excelled in school, so much so that my grades opened a rare opportunity. I was allowed to skip high school entirely and go straight from middle school into university level nursing studies. At 15, I was the youngest in my program. That made me stand out in ways that were both good and dangerous. A young man 4 years older took an interest in me. I was vulnerable, inexperienced, and in my words, he put his eyes on me. One day, he raped me. I became pregnant. In my community, being a single mother out of wedlock carried crushing stigma. Rather than supporting me, the adults around me arranged for me to marry the man who had assaulted me. Overnight, I lost control over my education, my body, and my future. Early on in our young marriage, he started hitting and abusing me. He choked me. He dictated every aspect of my life. There were no real options for protection. In our part of Mexico at that time, authorities often shrugged unless there was a murder or a lot of blood. Domestic abuse was normalized and minimized. I was forced to drop out of my nursing program. My husband, meanwhile, continued his own education, eventually finishing medical school and becoming a physician, a respected professional with money, status, and influence. I became pregnant again, and by my early 20s, I was the mother of 2 daughters and the victim of constant domestic violence. My grandparents remained my emotional lifeline. When my grandmother died at 17 and my grandfather later passed away as well, I felt the last of my protectors slip away. It was just him and me now, and he was my tormentor. The abuse and isolation pushed me into deep depression. Desperate and feeling trapped, I tried to take my own life multiple times. Once, I went to a building intending to jump, and my sister physically stopped me. Twice, I tried to overdose on pills. I felt death close to me, as if I had crossed the line and been pulled back. At one point, I tried to leave my husband. In retaliation, he kidnapped our older daughter from school and kept her for a week, knowing I would be forced to return to him to get my child back. It worked. I went back. The cycle of control tightened. Eventually, I initiated divorce proceedings with the help of a family friend who was a lawyer. My husband responded by gathering people to testify against me, trying to paint me as unstable and unfit to keep the children. With his status and money, he had every advantage. I had none. I realized that staying in Mexico meant more than living with abuse. It meant risking losing my children to a man who had already shown he would use them as weapons. So I made a decision. I would leave the country, planning the escape. By then, I had one thing that allowed me some independence. My grandfather had paid for me to train as a hairstylist against my husband's wishes. I eventually opened my own small salon. When I decided to escape, I sold everything I could, the salon chair, the equipment, my furniture. I emptied my credit card. What couldn't be sold, I donated to children's homes and to elder care facilities. I also had something else, faith. I believed God was with me and would show me the way. That faith didn't erase the fear, but it gave me enough courage to keep moving. I separated my living situation from my husband's, rented a house, then stepped into a kind of underground life, hopping between friends' homes, hiding, planning. I spoke to people who knew the migration routes. At first, I considered moving to another part of Mexico, but I knew his money, connections, and profession would allow him to track me down and legally fight for custody. Eventually, someone suggested the United States. I made arrangements with coyotes. Part of the plan was for my daughters to go ahead of me. At 9 and 3, Andrea and Ellie were sent first on the plane to Tijuana into the care of strangers. It took an almost unimaginable level of trust and desperation to let my babies out of my sight in the hope they would be safer on the other side. Then came my own crossing. Unlike my daughters, I did not get to sit quietly in a car and ride through the checkpoint. By the time it was my turn, I had been robbed in Tijuana, my jewelry and remaining money taken. I could no longer pay for the easier method of crossing. I was sent through the mountains. It was during an El Nino year, raining hard. I crossed on foot through mud and darkness, up and down hills, and eventually through tunnels. There were different stash houses along the way, one in San Diego, another in Pomona. At each point, the coyotes collected more money. At one stop, they demanded an extra $50 to complete the journey, threatening to send me back to Tijuana if I couldn't pay. $50 may not sound like much, but for me at that moment, it was everything. I had nothing left. The threat was real. If I couldn't pay, they would return me south without my children. In that moment, one of the coyotes intervened. He had been watching me and decided to help. He paid the $50 for me. When I asked his name, he said, Angel. To me, he truly was an angel. Eventually, they drove me north and arranged a call from a public payphone to the aunt's house in Santa Ana, where my daughters were staying. The coyotes warned that if the family did not have the money ready, they would return me to Tijuana. My aunt initially said she didn't have it. In panic, I insisted that my uncle did, even though I wasn't sure. They drove to the house anyway. If no one had answered the door, my life might have taken a very different turn. But my uncle did come to the door. They allowed me a moment to greet him. I hugged him, handed him the money that Angel had fronted me, and he handed it to the coyotes. Only then was I finally free to go inside. I stepped into the house quietly. It was late, almost midnight. Everyone was asleep. I began speaking softly from their beds. My daughters recognized their mother's voice. They ran into the living room, crying, hugging me, clinging to me. That moment, mother and daughters reunited in a foreign land after tunnels, kidnappings, separations, and near-death moments, is the emotional heart of our family story. I would carry the bruises of that journey on my body. All three of us would carry the memory in our souls, starting over and forgiveness. After a short time staying with our aunt, my daughters and I moved into a small rented room of our own. About a year later, chasing the hope of better work opportunities, we moved to Texas. I had heard I could work as a hairstylist there and eventually get licensed even without immigration papers. The law changed just as I arrived. Still, we tried. We lived in White Settlement, then Fort Worth and Arlington, jumping between cities over 9 months. We were almost always the only Mexican family in our neighborhoods. When it became clear that the licensing path wasn't going to work, we returned to Orange County, what I now call paradise, not because it is perfect, but because my daughters finally had stability. I supported the family as a hairstylist, and over time I did something remarkable. I went back to school and became a mental health therapist. I did it because I knew depression. I knew suicidal thoughts. I knew abuse, betrayal, and the crushing weight of feeling trapped. I wanted to help people who had been through similar darkness. My message to them is simple. If I survive, they can too. Years after arriving, with my daughters grown and our lives more stable, I began to seriously consider contacting my ex-husband, not to reconcile, but to close the circle, to speak as the person I had become, no longer a terrified teenage bride. Before I could, news came from Mexico. He was dead. My older daughter relayed the news. Officially, it was labeled a suicide. Unofficially, the details, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, made that story difficult to believe. In my eyes, it was clearly murder, and the authorities had little interest in investigating. By the time I heard this, I had already done the internal work of forgiving him. Not excusing what he did, not forgetting, but releasing the poison of hatred and resentment that could have consumed my life forever. Forgiveness, for me, was a form of liberation. I chose not to carry that poison anymore, living by the mercy of God. I talk about the sins of the fathers remaining on the heads of the children, passed down through generations. Abuse becomes normalized. I decided that the chain stopped with me. By living, by surviving, by refusing to let my daughters grow up thinking that abuse is normal, I broke that cycle. Today, we live in Orange County. I continue my work as a therapist and spiritual guide. My daughters, Andrea and Ellie, are building their lives. We are living proof that behind every headline about immigration are real human beings, a mother who broke a generational curse, daughters who grew up between languages and laws. We are living, as we say, by the mercy of God.